Guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren, auch ich darf Sie ganz herzlich begrüßen und mich bei AxME für die freundliche Einführung bedanken. Ich möchte jetzt ein Gespräch mit Ellen führen. Wir wollen uns kurz unterhalten, einige Fragen beantworten und ich hatte mir jetzt eigentlich vorgenommen, noch ein kurzes Statement zu machen über das Konzept der Ausstellung und so weiter und so fort. Aber da AxME das schon in einer sehr ausführlichen Weise gemacht hat, was es mit der Kunst und der Ausstellung auf sich hat, möchte ich eigentlich jetzt keine Zeit versäumen und direkt mit Ellen sprechen, weil ich glaube, es ist eine einmalige Gelegenheit, sie selbst zu hören zu ihrer Arbeit, und so werde ich jetzt auch in das Englische verfallen und Ellen einige Fragen stellen, die sie, wie ich weiß, in einer sehr eloquenten und profunden Art beantworten wird. So, Ellen, also from my side, thanks a million for this wonderful cooperation.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure to install the show, and I hope, Rita, you don't mind AxME's last remark that shows in Haus der Kunst always look better. He hasn't seen the version, the venue in tempera, so I hope you don't mind. Anyway, so Ellen, what I like to ask you first, there is this broad and very rich, formal and content-wise commitment in your work. So there are so many different layers that you bring together in a dialectical way. Could you tell us probably a bit about the background of the biographical references and the educational, because I think this is a point that seems to me always very important, to know what brought you there to do the art that you are doing.
I suppose in a way my family background was somehow not very connected to the visual arts, but more to literature and theater. So I guess I come more from that background. And growing up in a small New England town, Providence, Rhode Island, it's a port city, much like Rotterdam, where I ended up. And it's a coastal, so it's a port city and it's a tough city, but it's very sort of working class Irish Catholic background. My father's family was from Cape Verde, and so there are lots of these immigrant communities in Providence, and Providence is really about this mixture. In some ways, it's a more mixed, for example, than just 1 hour north in Boston, in Massachusetts.
Okay,
but it's a very tough working class city, so for me, we didn't really go to museums, so part of the way I started to find my way into making art was through labor and working with my hands.
So on the other hand, but also Providence is or was a center of the whaling industry, I think, which is very important for the whole New England coast.
Which would be why the Cape Verdean community is there.
So
that you find a
the
strong
whales are traveling from the Cape Verdes up to...
Well, they would be hired in Cape Verde and they would settle in these whaling ports like Rotterdam and Providence. So you have strong Cape Verdean communities in both of those cities.
So I mentioned this whaling because this is one of the many interesting influences and references that you take. On the one side, the natural science side, you worked in marine biology, and on the other side, we have the literature, the source of Melville's Moby Dick, which is a very, very strong issue and topic that always appears in your work.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
I wouldn't want to be presented as a marine biologist. I did it. My understanding of biology is very muddled, and I make a lot of it up.
You traveled on a research ship.
Actually, that was because I was sure that I would never fulfill my going. I went to Oberlin, which is in Ohio, and I was so sure I would never complete my science requirement that I heard about this program where you could sail in the Caribbean and have some science requirement. And the girl who interviewed me, because I was from Providence, Rhode Island, went to Rhode Island School of Design, was an artist. And she'd done the program 10 years ago and said, don't worry, it's bullshit. You just are scraping bird shit off of the boat. And you're basically sunbathing and sailing, it'll be great. And you fulfill all your science requirements. So I didn't intend I didn't know, but in the 10 years since she had done the program, it had become really rigorous. And so they were all MIT students. And I was, barely able to survive. And at the last moment, I finally chose my individual project, which, because I saw a scientist deliver a slide talk on pteropods, which are these two-footed snails that seem to float like butterflies in the ocean. And what I hadn't realized, because I was not a marine biologist, was that they were mostly microscopic, which meant that I was on the sailboat collecting these things through the water column and looking at them under a microscope with one eye and drawing with the other. And that sort of started my interest in drawing. So I realized I was more interested in drawing. That would be more primal than being a serious scientist. But some rubbed off.
But serious in a way that, as you describe it, that you really, with one eye in the microscope and the other eye drawing, that was really documentary drawings of these small animals that you found and that you saw there.
Yeah.
And you will all see in the exhibition why I asked this question, because it's very obvious in one of the probably most beautiful and important series of works, the Watery Ecstatics, where you really find traces of exactly this work. I mentioned already that your paintings, that your drawings, your collages are really, really multi-layered. I wouldn't say constructions, but the result of a very, very specific, complicated, not to say obsessive process. And my question would be, how would you say do you start this process? Because the multi-layerness, I mean not only in this formal sense, but also content-wise. And the question is, where do you start with? Is it the form that drives you or directs you to a certain content, or vice versa?
I think it's not a split for me in some cases. In some cases there is a clear split, like a painting like Bone Bright or IGBT, which you will see in the exhibition, are clearly, their elements are very clearly laid out beforehand. But in another work, like An Experiment of Unusual Opportunity, there's clearly, literally a discovery while working on the canvas. There was an idea about what it would be about, but I sort of found it through making. And so I go back and forth between those two ways of working.
How about Bird in Hand?
Well, one of the first classes I did take when I was 16 and was a printmaking class at Oberlin. And I think Bird in Hand is a really good example of, I think even before I thought I was studying art or something, I took this printmaking class because it was so manual and labor, and I like the zinc plate, and that you had to carve it, and you had all these acids. There was a kind of alchemy that rose out of it, and the image was somewhere else. And I think Bird in Hand is really about this intervention of the plate in a lot of ways. Even though it's a painting, it's sort of like I've dumped a lot of printmaking language into the skin of the painting. So, meaning that a lot of the signs are separate and are made, they're gathered separately, but they're also produced. Maybe I scan them on the computer, and then I reprint them out. So some things are printed, some things are drawn. It's hard to tell. But the idea is that it's not just built directly on the canvas. It's actually built, in pieces, the way a print is made, by several layers of a plate. Several plates will make a final image. So Bird in Hand is really about lots of various sort of technologies, but also signs and stories coming together to form a single image. And that's that particular work forms this image, and then as you move closer, you see it's quite disparate and it all falls apart. So your sense of perspective is shifting. And I think also in the yellow paintings, which we see an example here, this also uses a kind of printmaking technology. Yeah. But it's not a kind of fine printmaking. It's a really sort of, scanning all the images and then arranging them. So they're collected archival images. I scan them, I keep them like a kind of mad library, and then I reconfigure them out in a kind of web. And then I sit on top of that web and carve into it and build up these prosthetic forms, mostly wigs. But the printmaking is still important to me, that has been, and that in a way that you've got these very two elements there, the printed page that's, spewed out so quickly. It's really not fine printing, it's not with a plate, it's just with the inkjet. But the prosthetic on top sort of, even though it's an improvised thing from one to another, I think it slows down the reading. Because if you didn't have that, your eyes would scan it, and you would see this all over, black and white weave of newsprint, and somehow the construction catches you, I think, and slows down the viewing process. So you don't have a single image, as in Bird in Hand, that dissipates. I think you have a web that goes back and forth of content and stories as you move between the pages.
Now you answered already the questions that I wanted to ask you next. Thank you very much. Maybe one remark, the poster that you see behind us, and Ellen said that it's part of the so-called yellow paintings. We have 3 of them in the exhibition, and you will figure out that this is, in the original, one part of 396 that form these yellow paintings. And in the original, this has probably the size of a postcard. And of course, in the center of Bird in Hand is this mysterious figure, the Captain Ahab with a peg leg. Mm-hmm. And in the yellow paintings, we have peg leg as a tap dancer in the 20s and 30s who was very successful. And this opens up a whole different and different cosmos. Mm. And this is the social research, the research on how African Americans find their own identity. And this is also a very important layer of all your works from the very beginning to now. Mm. Can you tell us something about that?
For me, Melville was, Ahab is interesting to me as this, he's described as being bronze, and he's sort of comes in and out of being, and, when I think of, the way that Cape Verdean whalers, they often worked in the dories, which were the boats that went out, and the smaller boats that you see that go out from the, and they would be the harpooners. They're actually, it's the most sophisticated harpoon is actually invented by a Cape Verdean. If you go to these museums you like to go to in Nantucket, and also in Mystic Seaport. So I think this idea that Ahab might be of African descent is interesting to me, and I think interesting to Melville. And I find it really interesting that he's a pretty radical race writer, and the way he can sort of reach across into our present and still keep unfolding to us. And Pegleg Bates is Clayton Pegleg Bates is interesting to me in terms of how he develops over time. He crosses also a kind of time span from the vaudeville circuit to kind of the civil rights movement. And when I first discovered him was through an Ebony magazine ad, and what I really liked, one of the things I like thinking about Ahab, the way Melville describes him walking across the top of the deck of the ship, and he's dragging his leg, no, he's scraping it across. He's really scraping this heavy, and so you hear it, and it's really an oral, presence that he has. And then I think of, Pegleg Bates was this, bouncing. He literally bounced off of that peg. He didn't hobble about. He really.
So there are film documents of his performances?
Yeah, and because he kept performing it. In the end, he was performing also with Moms Mabley in the 60s, and so, and when he retires, when I come across him, he's opened up a resort in the Catskills, and what I really liked was the way he was using his whole body, and he's opened up a resort that he actually invited a lot of young civil rights workers to come and be together. And so it was sort of quiet, and he was sort of forgotten by then, but he was still a kind of presence in a kind of communal consciousness. And I liked also that I experienced him as a map first, because it's a map to tell you, it's like a lover's motel, and interracial couples are welcome, and so it's all, and he's giving you a map. It's like just off the Catskills, and then he's standing there, and so I liked that I sort of saw him as a beacon, and that he was using his whole body, and it was a map.
His confidence.
His confidence, but also this kind of physicality that was both a kind of portrayal of someone, but also a map at the same time. So it was this kind of projection out in space, which I think of his dance, or that he was both, a kind of old vaudeville figure, but he was also something else. There was some sort of, that he was literally, this ad was literally a map to this place, I thought was really interesting.
Thanks, Ellen. One and final question, which is, I think, a more general question I would like to ask you. You entered the art scene in the beginning of the 90s. And do you feel that there is a stronger presence or stronger influence, if you can say so, of African or African American artists since you came up to build your own career? I'm thinking of, all these Kara Walker, David Hammonds, Lorna Simpson, Lynette Yadum-Boccacci, Theaster Gates, Steve McQueen. There is Stan Douglas, a whole, not only one, but now 2 generations of artists. Do you feel there is more interest, or do you say, well, this is of no importance for the development of a career in the art world?
I've seen that in terms of my own work. I think that it's not just about the increase. It's not. I'm not sure that there are more artists. Mm-hmm. I think that the language has deepened because there are more African and African American curators and writers. So it's a thicker web in some ways. But I also think that. I don't think that means there are more, but I think what we are also seeing happen are, you're seeing presences become delayed kind of presences. So you're seeing what you sort of spoke to about this mixed, not one generation, but so you're seeing artists like Terry Atkins, having a kind of a delay and then becoming very important. And so we're seeing these different kind of nodes happen, and so it speaks to a kind of loss. So while there seems to be more presence, the present foregrounds also a loss, something that didn't happen in time. And I think that's what I think about this moment, I guess.
Thank you so much, Ellen. Meine Damen und Herren, ich will Sie jetzt nicht länger auf die Folter spannen. Sie wollen zu Recht die Ausstellung jetzt sehen und Sie können sich sehr darauf freuen. Ich möchte mich nochmal dem Dank anschließen, den Okwuenweso schon ausgebracht hat, an Neil Wenman, der uns sehr, sehr unterstützt hat. Mark Francis desgleichen. Ich vermute ihn auch irgendwo unter uns. Auch ihm herzlichen Dank. Ich möchte dann auch dem Team danken und da gestatten Sie mir bitte ein besonderes Wort. Ich habe das gestern auch schon gesagt. Unser Team sind nicht nur junge Leute, die Löcher in die Wand bohren und die Bilder gerade aufhängen. Es sind alles junge Künstler, mehr oder weniger. Und sie leisten für mich, jetzt speziell auch in der Ausstellung mit Ellen, deshalb möchte ich das jetzt mal zum Ausdruck bringen, mehr als das. Man kann mit ihnen diskutieren über Hängung und sie geben einem den einen oder anderen wirklich wichtigen Hinweis. Und ich möchte mich an dieser Stelle nochmal ganz herzlich bedanken bei dem Hängeteam vom Haus der Kunst. Last but not least, gestatten Sie mir bitte eine persönliche Bemerkung. Gestern Nacht ist einer unserer großen Kollegen, Jan Hut, leider verstorben. Und ich brauche Ihnen eigentlich über Jan Hut nichts zu erzählen. Er war einer der großen Freidenker und Querdenker mit einer ungeheuren Originalität, wie er die Documenta 9 gemacht hat. Das ist uns wahrscheinlich allen noch sehr im Bewusstsein und ich möchte den heutigen Abend Jan Hut widmen. Vielen Dank.